First, I wanted to thank the ABA Death Penalty Representation Project and the hundreds, thousands of pro bono lawyers who have given your time, our time, and heart and sweat to take on what are among the most emotionally wrenching, taxing, and yet rewarding cases that in our lifetimes we'll ever have the opportunity to work on. Congratulations also to all of you who've worked with the Death Penalty Representation Project on reaching the milestone of not just 100 wins, but 100 cases in which our clients have won relief and then been freed forever of the possibility of execution. That is phenomenal. I'd also, well, everyone else has said this, and then they'll say it better, but Ron Tabak is, among many things, he's indefatigable. And he was my first roommate at the Airlie Death Penalty Conference, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, in 1994. And once you've had Ron Tabak as your roommate, there is nobody else who compares. But as a member of, he's also a member of my board of directors, so I have to be nice. But the advice that we've gotten from Ron is the same as the advice that he's given to everybody else here. You wait to hear what he has to say, and then you figure out how to put it to work. Tonight I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, Larry Krasner. Larry spent his entire law career doing things that most of us, including himself, thought would make him unelectable to anything. At Stanford Law School, he worked for indigenous rights, homeless people, for the poor. And then in 1987, he returned to Philadelphia, where, as all good politicians in waiting do, he went to work for the Public Defender's Office. Also as a federal public defender, so we were in the same office, not at the same time, but we heard the stories. And in 1993, he and a fellow public defender, who is now a judge of the Third Circuit, Felipe Restrepo, opened their own law practice specializing in criminal defense and civil rights. Now, among the notable cases that Larry handled, he is most well known for suing the cops. He has filed more than 75 civil rights suits against the police for corruption and for physical abuse. This is a person who has spent his career not just telling truth to authority, but holding them to account. And he's represented protesters at political conventions. He's represented people in the Black Lives Matters movement who have been arrested for protests. And he has put not just his money, but his actions where his mouth is. During his campaign for office, Larry said he would work for real criminal justice reform. And he likened the wastefulness of Philadelphia's death penalty system, which had a record of more than 200 death sentences imposed and a single execution of a mentally ill man who had waived his appeals. He likened this to lighting taxpayers' dollars on fire. Now, despite Larry's best efforts to become unelectable, he was elected in 2012 on this platform of criminal justice reform. And it wasn't just a platform. We have the pleasure of watching it in action. And what's happening in Philadelphia is not just local. We are watching as reform prosecutors have gotten elected across the country. And they look to Philadelphia and to Larry for inspiration. Because if in the hostile city of brotherly love, you are able to accomplish the kinds of things that he is accomplishing, then maybe you can do it in Nashville. Maybe you can do it in other places. Since 2015, voters have gotten the idea. We keep track, because information is what we're about, of where the death penalty is imposed and where it isn't, who are the bad actors and who aren't. 2% of the counties in the United States account for 58% of everybody who's on death row. And that means if you can find the bad actors, you can take a real bite out of the way in which the death penalty is administered. In the 1990s, Philadelphia sent 10 people to death row every year, 98 people in the course of the decade. In Larry Krasner's administration, nobody has gone to death row. And criminal justice reform really means criminal justice reform, not just at the highest level of punishment, but across the board. So his administration is taking steps to decriminalize mental illness, addiction, and poverty. They are moving to end cash bail for the least severe offenses. They're aiming not to impose sentences that destroy families and destroy neighborhoods and make it so that we are punishing not just the offender, but everyone who depends on that person for their livelihood. He's taken on police corruption and bad cops and established a conviction review unit that has now exonerated 9 people who were wrongly convicted of murder. And his office has filed pleadings, which you may have heard about, and just last week argued before the Pennsylvania Supreme Court that the death penalty in Pennsylvania violates its state constitution. Now, I promised Emily I wouldn't talk about numbers, but 72%, sorry about that, 72% of all Philadelphia death penalty cases have been overturned in the courts, mostly for ineffective representation. So Larry said to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, that's arbitrary. Now, it shouldn't take a genius to figure it out, but so far the courts haven't quite gotten it. What is genius is that a prosecutor's office would be saying that to the state's highest court. And the court has had ample opportunity. The state has had ample opportunities to do something about it, but for 30 years, they've refused. And with the legislature doing nothing and the courts doing nothing, Larry Krasner's administration said the time has come to declare the death penalty unconstitutional. Let's set aside numbers for a second and get to really the heart of this. It wasn't the worst of the worst being sentenced to death. It was the poorest, and it was the blackest, and it was the brownest. And that's what Larry Krasner said. And frankly, I'd like to hear more of what he has to say. So now I'd like to introduce to you Philadelphia's District Attorney, Larry Krasner.
That was nice, thank you. I do want you to know I'm absolutely shocked that a federal public defender would listen to the Grateful Dead. That's hard for me to even imagine. So, yeah, we are here to talk about the death penalty. But to be really honest with you, I'm actually down here for a completely different reason. And I'm down here with several people from my office because we're recruiting. We have been, in the last couple days, recruiting heavily at Howard, and we've been at UDC, we're at Georgetown, pretty much all day tomorrow, and this is what we do in this cycle. We spend 2 months going all over the country. We go to California, we go to Texas, we go to the Midwest, we go up and down the East Coast. We were at Harvard the other day, and we recruit. And for those of you who are in big law firms, we're doing better than you. And we pay a lot less than you. and all of them have made 10-year commitments, so don't even try it. There is an excitement, and there is an excitement among young people, and there's an excitement among law students about this phenomenon of there being progressive district attorneys around the country. I was just with a number of them. There's a wonderful organization called Fair and Just Prosecution out of Los Angeles, run by a former federal prosecutor, which has become the club of the progressive prosecutors, wherever you may draw that line. And there are about 30 of us, and we were in Montgomery, Alabama, and in Selma, and we were all together with a pretty large number of progressive chiefs of police and other law enforcement officials, and yes, they exist, and yes, some of them are really good people for the last few days, and needless to say, you cannot be in Alabama without thinking pretty seriously about the death penalty. I'll just leave it at that. But anyway, so we're here to recruit, and that is what we've been doing, and that's what we'll be doing for 2 months, and we are also here only about 10 days after our last recruited class started at the Philadelphia DA's office. It's about 65 lawyers, 65 new lawyers from all over the country, coming off of circuit court clerkships, coming off of having been a prison guard for 10 years, military intelligence, police officer in Prince George County, coming off of PhDs in philosophy, coming from essentially every HBCU law school in the United States, except the one that wouldn't let us in last year, and we'll work on that this year. They're an amazing bunch of people, and they feel like they're part of a movement only because they're part of a movement. That's really the only reason why. So as I said, we're here to recruit. I think a lot of the people in this room probably feel like they've been recruited as well during their lives. I was asking several of you, why do you do this, earlier today, and I got a sort of procedural incantation about how that came to pass as opposed to something much more visceral, much more basic about how you view the planet or the universe or whatever it is. And it occurred to me as I was asking this question that I didn't really have a good answer for how I became involved in doing what I do, and one of the things I used to do was death penalty representation as a criminal defense attorney. And so I played that out, and I realized that maybe there has been kind of a procedural event. Maybe all of what I'm doing now does have something to do with a way that I was recruited during the course of my life. Where does it start? Not sure. My dad served in World War II. So did all of my uncles. That tells you something about what governments can do to their own people. I went to college, came out, wasn't sure what I would do with my life, was considering 3 different career choices, one of them being law because I like to argue with people. And I got called to jury duty in the first death penalty case after Furman versus Georgia in that particular county, which is adjoining Philadelphia. It was a particularly horrible case. It was a case in which an elderly woman was stomped, raped, killed. Her house was lit on fire and burned down around her. And it was also a case in which guilt was very clear. As it happened, her son was an FBI agent, and within 24 hours, the county was flooded with FBI agents, and the man who had been working on the premises was found in a hotel, and outside of, it was a motel actually, and outside of his motel room was her car, and on her car was her blood, with his thumbprint in the blood on the mirror. And that was, needless to say, not the only evidence, but it was not a case where there was any serious question that it was horrible or that this person was innocent. It was also an unusual case because we were a sequestered jury, which is a true rarity in Pennsylvania, but this county had determined it was going to be such a high publicity case that they should take all of these jurors. They should, do what you do best in serious matters, which is do a crappy voir dire, and then they should take us and send us off to a different motel where we would all dine together and share rooms with each other and remain until the incredibly stressful event of being on a jury in a case like that was over, and so that's what we did. I was at that time right out of college. I was working as a carpenter. As I figured out what to do next, they did not ask me, have you applied to law school? when I went for voir dire, and they did not very specifically ask me what I thought of the death penalty either. I don't know why, but they didn't. I think, honestly, the prosecution might have been blinded by my whiteness, and I think it may also be that we were dealing on both sides with not the best lawyering. But I was picked, and I was put on this jury, and I went through that experience. And so, when it came time for us to deliberate on the guilt phase, because there's obviously a separate phase for death, we went in the back, and one of our members, who'd been acting a little bit peculiar for some time, stood up, and he pulled a tiny Bible out of his back pocket, which he was holding upside down, and he started mumbling something about, who am I to judge another man, which we thought was a little unusual. And so various members of the jury started to ask this person precisely what was he trying to say, and it became apparent that there was some pretty serious mental illness going on, which we had not detected earlier, although I had a hint, but there was some pretty serious mental illness going on, and he was declaring that he would under no circumstance render a verdict. This, of course, required us to send a note, which I drafted, with the support of the others, saying, Judge, there's 11 of us think we can, come to a verdict, but this guy's not doing good here, which we sent. The hint I had and should have really paid attention to was that the day before, while we were all sitting cheek by jowl, eating together, he was holding his menu upside down. But anyway, I corrected his menu at the time, only to see him doing something similar with a tiny Bible the next day. We rendered a verdict, and the verdict was first degree, among other things. We rendered that verdict with the expectation that we were going to end up going out to a death phase. Certain things happened while we were rendering the verdict. One was, I got the following input. Now, this is Pennsylvania we're talking about, from a man who wore cowboy boots to court every day. This is a juror, and had a cowboy belt with a cowboy belt buckle. We got the following advice as a jury, which was, come on now, we know what we all got to do. We got to get this boy. Yes, the defendant was African American. Yes, the victim was white. That made some of us a little upset, not enough of us. And we said a few things about that. And then there were some racist comments about some of the jurors who were more careful and wanted to take more time and took these rights more seriously. So we rendered our verdict, thinking that we were going to have to come back out for a death phase. And if you looked in the jury box at that moment, you would see some of us kind of sitting sideways, a little crumpled up, looking sullen, not too happy, contemplating what was coming next. And you saw the cowboy, and he was happy as could be. There were people who had not a care in the world, and there were people who felt like they were sitting under a huge weight, some kind of enormous burden that they would have to settle. Judge announced that there would be no death phase, and there would be no death phase because as a result of the removal of one of the 12 jurors in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, a deal had been struck between the defense and the prosecution that the defense would accept a verdict of 11 and that the prosecution would drop the death phase. And so I never faced having to make that decision in that particular context. Fast forward, I'm an attorney, been practicing for a while, tried a lot of cases. Get my first death penalty case. Not guilty. All charges. Duck that one. Second death penalty case. Certainly more challenging. Voluntary manslaughter, which is a lower level. Homicide offense obviously does not permit the death penalty. Third death penalty case, which I tried very shortly before I decided I really needed to run for DA, was a triple murder of parents in front of their children on one of their birthdays. 3 first-degree verdicts. Wrenching death phase was conducted, and the death sentence was avoided, but only because after 5 years of preparation, the use of a mitigation expert, incredibly serious efforts that pretty much, broke the bank, because that's what happens when you try to do the job right. We found the night before the death phase, in documents we'd never seen before, we found that the defendant had been, according to contemporaneous records, raped when he was 12 years old in an alley by a stranger, which is something he had never said due to his own mental impairments, something we had gotten from no source, and frankly, something he didn't even recall or know how to report. He avoided a death sentence by 2 votes, and it was pretty close. So I think in a way I was recruited into that by some of those early experiences, like being on a death jury. And then I think I was maybe recruited into this, which is changing your skin and becoming a prosecutor. I think maybe I was recruited into this by 30 years of being a very active trial lawyer who was in court 4 to 5 days a week, sometimes in federal, mostly in state court in various counties, but mostly Philly, and seeing how rotten Philly was during the period of a certain DA who got the death penalty 109 times in 19 years, was dubbed the, quote, Queen of Death, unquote, by the New York Times, and repeatedly made statements in public, including to the New York Times, that she was, quote, passionate, unquote, about the death penalty. I think that's kind of maybe how I got recruited to this, because God knows it was never my goal to run for everything and anything, and it was really never my goal to run for DA, but there came a point when I had kind of sort of just had enough. And that point happens more or less to coincide with that triple murder case that I tried. So, speaking of recruiting, it just so happens that there's a club of progressive prosecutors, and there are about 30 of them. That's a lot. I mean, you can look back and you can say, back in the day, there was Liz Holtzman. She was it. And you can look, at a few years ago, and you can say that some of the early and most important members of this group were, for example, Kim Foxx in Chicago, or it was Dan Satterberg in Seattle, he was of that variety who started out traditional prosecutors but turned and changed because of their experiences. But there's 30 now, and an awful lot of them are in the largest cities, and that is no accident, because there is, in fact, a national effort to end mass incarceration. And what that means is you put prosecutors in power in the big cities. What does power mean when you're talking about a prosecutor? Well, here's the deal. What you all do is absolutely marvelous work. I have done it, or at least I've done some of it as a trial lawyer. You try to get justice from prosecutors who are terrible people. You talk nice. You try to persuade them. You appeal to their non-existent decency. Okay? And meanwhile, they go home and shine up their cowboy boots and put them on and get ready to go watch an execution. So when that execution is over, they can come out and crow to a whole bunch of local television, microphones, and cameras about how they're keeping everybody safe, which we all know is absolute nonsense. That's what you do. You are St. George trying to slay the dragon. Or maybe trying to persuade the dragon to be nice, right? Well, it would be nice if the dragon was nice. Wouldn't it? I mean, wouldn't that be a good thing? And wouldn't it also be boring if the dragon was nice to be St. George? So I told you I was here to recruit. And what I have to tell you is this. This particular election cycle is fairly light in terms of the number of prosecutors, chief prosecutors' positions that are up. But the next election cycle, which is only a couple years away, it's going to be a whole lot more. It's about 3 times as many chief prosecutor positions that are coming up. Can anybody imagine an attorney who's done federal habeas death penalty work for their career becoming a district attorney? My goodness, isn't that ridiculous? Except, I'm sorry? I will endorse you. And Kelly's already committed as well. But the point is, you got to get your mind right. This is something Martin Luther King used to always say. If you want to fix a problem, you've got to get your mind right. You are used to being on the outside, even if you're in a big law firm that compensates you well as you do a bunch of pro bono work. You're on the outside. You are banging your head against the outside of district attorneys' offices, and you are trying to persuade terrible people. Who do you think your death penalty client or potential death penalty client wants you to be? Do you think they want you to be the one who comes up and dutifully visits them on death row or before that trial? Do you think that's who they want you to be because they really like you as a friend? Or do you think they would like you to be the prosecutor who decides whether or not to pursue the death penalty and decides what you're going to put in that brief? Especially when often what you put in that brief is, I do not oppose this going from death to life. I know you're charming people. I know you're really fun to visit with. But I absolutely guarantee you, your client knows that the power to change their condition is in the prosecutor. Prosecutors have a different kind of power. I'll try not to go all night, although I'm really having fun. But prosecutors have a different kind of power. A United States senator is very powerful, except that poor individual has to talk to Mitch McConnell, right? And once again, this is like a good person trying to persuade a person who's terrible, right? And then they have to log roll and they have to come to agreements. Yes, indeed, we'll destroy the ozone in exchange for changes to various rules about habeas, right? I mean, that's kind of like what you got to do. Prosecutors don't do any of that. The system was so baked to give prosecutors so much power because they were so rotten that now these people are stuck with all this case law that says the system gives prosecutors all this power. You know? Yeah, I was on a jury. Yeah, I was a defense lawyer. What I do now is I sit with people in my office, and we, for example, had to consider 4 cases in which the prior administration had noticed that we were going to seek death. And we individually and carefully considered each and every one of those cases and exercised our discretion individually and carefully in each and every one of those cases not to pursue it. We have had other cases brought to us, including incredibly high-pressure ones. For example, one involving the murder of a police officer who was in a store buying a gift for his child when 2 serial robbers came in and triangulated him and shot him on video as he drew fire away from other civilians in there. And oh my goodness, was there a bunch of pressure. But guess who got to make the decision? So not only am I here to recruit, I'm here to tell you that all of you who have dedicated your life to the good and decent work of death penalty representation are basically immoral. Because you had the choice, and you have the choice to have all the power. You have the choice to win. You have the choice to do what your clients actually want from you, which is not a good effort. It is a victory. And that doesn't mean you all have to run, although I already understand we have 2 candidates. But there are many roles that you can play. Anybody in a large law firm who wants to tell me they've never met with a candidate and they've never donated, please. We all know that large law firms play a role in politics. They make decisions in politics. We know that. Anybody who wants to tell me that people who do the work you do can't win, well, sorry, that'd be me, and that would be Parisa, Tafti, Degani. Did I get the name right? I think so. Who's an awesome person, by the way, and just won the Democratic primary and has no opponents in Virginia. Wow. So yeah, it actually is a fact that you can do what I did, which is be unelectable, run, and win, right? And for those of you who are too decent to be in politics, what you can do is you can organize. I got elected by a bunch of activists. none of whom danced as well as you just did. But I got elected by a bunch of activists. I spent 25 years representing activists for free. It was another one of my good business plans. And when the time came, they, frankly, wanted to help me because they still had that monkey on their back of they owed me because I represented them 20 years ago. Activists are incredibly capable. They are better at politics than politicians. They have circles of influence. They are persuasive. They are persistent. And especially with social media, they can do a hell of a lot for free. And so I had an army of about 400 people who would do something as simple as take a 10-minute announcement video and get 20,000 hits on it within a week by spreading it within social media for absolutely no money. Well, yeah, dance or not. I mean, these guys can do a lot. And people in law firms who don't want to run, but no one who should run, can show up and say, we're going to support you, we're going to back you, we're going to help you in different ways. And if you're not the one, I'm looking at you, Dunham, but if you're not the one, you know somebody who is or who could be and who is so locked in to this binary notion, and we all know binary notions are dangerous, locked into this binary notion of traditional prosecutor, traditional defender. Well, I am here to say there's something in the middle, and it is a progressive prosecutor. It is someone like me who did a lot of individual justice for a lot of years and just watched the system get worse and worse and worse and worse. The entire time I was doing some justice for individuals, there are people who can step up and they can make sweeping changes. There is a reason, and I will quit soon, I promise. There is a reason why one presidential candidate after another is wearing out their phone calling progressive prosecutors all over the country. There is a reason why there's a hot debate going on among these candidates, not about when voting rights should be restored, but whether they should be voting in jail. And the reason is that we are in the middle of what is arguably the most, or certainly one of the most important civil rights movements of our time. I would venture a guess it may have started when Michelle Alexander put out her book, and maybe got a little bit deeper when Brian Stevenson put out Just Mercy, and maybe John Pfaff's book Locked In meant something to some people, and maybe James Foreman Jr.'s, I gotta say something about him, by the way. So I was in Birmingham, and I knew James Foreman Jr.'s dad was James Foreman, I just didn't really know who that was. I'm walking through the Legacy Museum, and who the hell is right next to Martin Luther King in like 5 of these pictures? It's James Foreman Sr., who at the time was in SCLC or SNCC or something like that, but was a very, very seriously involved, right? Big surprise then that we have this civil rights movement where James Foreman Jr. wins the Pulitzer Prize for that amazing book. And you will soon see when the movie of Just Mercy comes out, which will be the end of December, and when it is blasted everywhere on Martin Luther King Day, you will soon see that it will have the kind of influence that the movie The 13th had. We are dealing about 10 years in to a major civil rights movement with about another 20 years in which mass incarceration can be reversed and in which we can truly change the way the death penalty is addressed in the United States. And we can take an awful lot of money that we were lighting on fire and we can put it back into everything that we all know does a better job of preventing crime, like public schools, ... We can do that. And all you gotta do is not let history pass you by. That's all you gotta do, is find your position. As with every protest, there are allies. There's the ones who bring the snacks. There's the ones who take down everybody's, next of kin, phone number, address, and write down who has a cat that's gonna need to be fed. Because when the Philadelphia police arrest you all and stick you in jail for 36 hours, somebody's gotta feed your cat. There are those people. There are the grandmothers I represented who used to walk into military recruiting offices and present the recruiters with an apple pie with an American flag in it as they explained to them and tied up every desk that the war in Iraq was a bad idea, right? I mean, there are so many roles you can play other than being the main show. But the people who should be the main show are not a bunch of people who've run for office 3 times. They're probably not a bunch of people who even want to run for office. They're not a bunch of people who thought about it, and they're the ones that you need to either be, or go get, or support, or hold the snacks for, or whatever it may be, because they are the future of how you get to win. You get to do what is decent, and you get to win. Thank you very much.